To cover up the crime, the man led the live cow to the top of the dry well. The bull panics. Then the man pulls off the plank. Unsurprisingly, the bull fell heavily into the well. Listening to the cow's wailing, the man shoots the cow to end its life. The two men then brought in a large amount of soil to fill the well. Of course, they didn't do it just to kill a cow, because underneath the well was the wife he had killed. Soon after, the police came to investigate her disappearance, but the father and son were not at all alarmed. They tell the sheriff that their loved one may have gone to live in the big city. At first, the police were skeptical, but during the investigation, they found no useful clues, so the sheriff believed them for the time being. Before leaving, the sheriff noticed the dry well. The men explained that a few days ago, the cow had fallen into the well and died. They sealed the well for fear that the body would stink and attract rats. The police closed the case by saying that the wife had run away from home, and the father and son had a good reason to fill the well. They thought it was a perfect job. Who knew the men would pay a terrible price? The story is set in 1922. The man's name is Bob and his wife's name is Gina, and his son Shuai, who had just come of age. The three of them form a happy family. Because she was an only child, Gina inherited 40 acres of land after her father's death, combined with her husband's 30 acres. That's 70 acres. The couple went straight to becoming the most promising farmers in the area. From then on, Bob had something to look forward to. He thought that if he farmed well, he'd make a fortune. But his wife, who had just inherited the land, thought differently. At dinner, Gina suddenly asked him to sell his land and go to live in the city. Bob was furious when he heard this. He would never allow his land to be taken away from him. The next day, he tries to convince his wife to change her mind, but Gina wouldn't listen to her husband. She claimed she would only sell her 40 acres. She wouldn't touch her husband's land. Once she gets the money, she'll take her son to the city and open a clothing shop. Bob didn't want to give up either the land or his son, but the wife wanted to take it all away from him. After inheriting the land, Gina has become much tougher to talk to. Now she'd rather work in the city than stay in the country. The couple had a big fight. Then Bob had a terrible idea, the most direct way to kill Gina, but he's afraid his son will hate him. Now he must get Shuai on his side. It so happened that Bob saw his son in love with his neighbor Jenny. At that moment, he knew he had a chance. In the cornfield, Bob spoke to his son. He told Shuai that he had to break up with the girl immediately. After all, the mother would soon sell the land. By the time they reach the big city, they'll never see each other again for the rest of their lives. At dinner, Shuai is clearly distracted. Bob knew he had achieved his goal. It wasn't long before his son exploded, but just as he was about to say he'd stay, his mother slapped him across the face. She didn't care what her son thought. He had to leave in a few days. As expected, Shuai went to his father to discuss the situation. Bob's suggestion was the most direct and effective, that the two of them should work together to kill his wife. After the discussion, the husband approached Gina for a chat. During the conversation, he said that he and his son were willing to go to the big city with her. The wife looked incredulous. Bob's words made Gina very happy. At night, the three of them had a big party at home. Gina got drunk from the excitement. Unbeknownst to her, this seemingly good thing had a hidden agenda. As soon as his wife went to bed, he came to the bed with his son. The man, together with his son, brutally murdered his wife. Afterwards, he wrapped the body in a sheet and threw it into a dry well, but due to the shock, Shuai directly fell asleep in the same place. Fortunately, the distance from the well is not far. Bob dragged the body with difficulty, finally threw it into the well. Afterwards, the two of them began to clean the blood from the house. They worked from 8 p.m. to 9 a.m. From then on, he was haunted. A few days later, his wife's buyer came to the door to talk about taking the land. Bob had already thought of a way to deal with it. He described his wife as having packed up and left for the big city a while ago. In that case, their previous agreement should be cancelled. Seeing that the other guy still didn't believe him, Bob called his son to confirm his story. This finally got rid of the buyer. Afterwards, Shuai, fearing jail, suggested filling the well, but Bob knew that his wife's disappearance would attract the police. If the well was filled now, the police would be suspicious. So father and son led a big yellow cow to the top of the well. Then Bob pulled out the boards, and the cow died with a puzzled look on its face. Afterwards, the two of them used dirt to cover it up, and sure enough, the police soon arrived to investigate his wife's disappearance. They came to his room without saying a word. Bob said that a few days ago, the couple had a big fight. At night, his wife left without saying goodbye because she left in a hurry. She only took with her clothes and a sum of money. On hearing this, Shuai chimed in. Although the sheriff believed the father and son, but when he was leaving, he noticed the dry well. Bob replied that his bull had drunk too much yesterday and fallen into the well. He was worried about the stink of the body, so he filled in the well. The police again believed Bob's story. In the end, his wife's disappearance was ruled a runaway. I thought this would be the end of the story, but the real nightmare had just begun. Bob was woken up that night by the sound of cows wailing, so he went to the barn with a lamp to check it out. At some point, a lot of rats got into the place. All of them came from the pipes, and the pipe was connected to a dry well. And what's worse, there's a terrible stench coming from inside. Bob almost threw up his food when he took a whiff. To solve the problem, Bob made another bucket of fresh cement the next day to cover up the murder. Worse still, there was an accident on his son's side. It turned out Shuai's girlfriend was more than 2 months pregnant. He wanted his father to give him some money to marry her, but Bob dismissed his son on the grounds that they were too young. Shuai was furious at this statement. He even regretted that he should accompany his mother to live in the big city. In the middle of the argument, his girlfriend's father came over. He forced Bob to pay $800 as a bride price. Otherwise, the two children would stop seeing each other. But now the hero can't even come up with $8. Because of this year's drought, he lost a lot of money. Afterwards, he warned Shuai to forget about the girl, but this time, the son didn't listen to him. The son regrets it. He should have listened to his mother and sold the land. If he had done so, he wouldn't have ended up in this mess. That night, the son ran away with his girlfriend. After Shuai's departure, Bob's life became a mess. If no one inherits the land, then his efforts will be meaningless. To get his son back, he mortgaged the land with the bank and got $750. He was going to take this money and go out to get his son back, but just as Bob was getting his luggage, something happened. He was looking for something when a mouse bit his hand. What he didn't realize was that this would be the beginning of a man's nightmare. At first Bob thought it was just a flesh wound. He thought it was just a flesh wound that would heal after a few days of rest. Instead, the wound became more painful. When the gauze was removed, the situation was far worse than he thought. The wound had become infected and was festering. He had to go to the hospital, but the snow and wind outside put him off. Back home, Bob could only find relief in the form of painkillers. At that moment, the door of the room was pushed open without warning. The hero saw his murdered wife. She kept approaching Bob, as if to tell him that he is a murderer. In a panic, Bob slipped and fell to the basement. Luckily, the police showed up in time to take him to the hospital. The bad news was that Bob's left hand was badly infected and was amputated. Before he could be upset, the sheriff told him even worse news. 2 days ago, the police found the bodies of his son and his girlfriend. It turns out Shuai had bought a gun with the only money he had left after running away with his girlfriend. He also went from petty theft to robbery. They were once wanted by the police, but you can't always walk on the river without getting your shoes wet. Until one day, they finally hit the nail on the head. This time Shuai robbed a restaurant, but just before he left, the owner shot his girlfriend. The police will arrest them if they go to the hospital. Shuai had no choice but to put his girlfriend in an abandoned building. In order to keep warm, he found a lot of dry wood in the neighborhood, while his son was building a fire and thinking about the future. Turned around and saw that his girlfriend had lost her vital signs. At this moment Shuai was completely devastated. All he could do was to put his clothes on his girlfriend, to make her death look dignified, and Shuai finally chose to die with his girlfriend. Then the police brought Bob to claim the body. The moment the white cloth was pulled away, the hero was no longer calm, because his son's face had been gnawed by rats. From that day on, Bob was devastated. Not a single relative attended his son's funeral. No one wanted to mourn a robber. Bob's 70 acres of land was repossessed by the bank because he couldn't pay his mortgage, and his house was put up for sale. Bob had no choice but to move to the big city to make money. He thought the heavy workload would help him forget the past, but the ghost of his wife and the rats kept coming back. In 2 years, Bob spent all his savings on alcohol, until one day, 8 years later, the old man walked into a hotel. He writes down his past on a piece of paper. He thought for the millionth time, if he had listened to his wife and settled in the big city, then his lover and son wouldn't have ended up like this. Maybe the family would still be living happily ever after. At the end of the film, the hero finishes the letter, and he will meet his dead relatives with regret. This is the end of the film.